Marcel and the family were glad we would finally get together and honor Tom. I would like to tell them a story if I could, and that is that Kathy and I started going to this church nearly 30 years ago. That's when we met Tom and Marcel, and you know, Tom and I would chit chat a little bit after church, and which is common, and you know, we had a commonality in that we're both engineers, so we talked a little bit about engineering. We talked about how the oil and gas business is going and things of that nature. And we talked about where we're currently working, but not really our background too much. And fast forward just a couple of years, and I went to work at S&B Engineers, and I'm in a meeting with my project team one day. Actually went on about a few times, and we'd be in a meeting, and the process folks, there'd be problems that need to be solved, and just time and time again they say, well, what would Tom do? And how would Tom handle this? And finally one day I said, who is this Tom? And do we need to get him on the team? And come to find out it was Tom Ledbetter. And I said, well, I know Tom Ledbetter, but I didn't know he'd ever worked at S&B Engineers. So I came back to church that next Sunday and saw Tom, and I told him what had happened and the story behind that, and he just beamed that big smile. And then we really had a lot to talk about of things. And but I think it really speaks volume to the character of the man, that he could influence and leave his mark and in so many ways and with so many people. That's what he did. Thomas Kent Ledbetter, age 86, of Houston, died on April 29, 2021. He was born December 13, 1934 in Waxahachie, Texas, to Claude Thomas and Ella Ruth Ledbetter. On December 21st, 1957, he married Marcel Follis of Houston, Texas, marking the beginning of 63 years of a very happy marriage. Tom lived most of his early life in Houston, but graduated high school in Waxahachie. After high school, he attended the University of Texas, where he graduated with honors with a BS degree in chemical engineering in 1958. During the early years of his 40-year career, he worked for a variety of companies engaged in both production and engineering design. Some of his most enjoyable years were the 19 he was employed by S&B Engineers, where he served as process manager as a number of significant projects. He finished his career with Lippmann Raytheon, where he retired in 1999 as technical director, polymers and chemicals. I will say there's several S&B folks here today as well. Tom is preceded in death by his parents and by his son, Michael Don Ledbetter of Houston, Texas. Survivors include wife Marcel Ledbetter of Houston, daughter Tamara Seal Fowler, and husband Terry of Pearland, Texas, son Timothy Kent Ledbetter and wife Angela of Euless, Texas, grandchildren Adam and Jordan Fowler, Kara and Grant Ledbetter, and Sidney Ledbetter. He is also survived by his brother, Cecil Don Ledbetter, and wife Kay, and his sister, Claudette Bratcher, as well as numerous cousins, nephews, and nieces, and friends.
Marcel requested that I read Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his namesake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Good afternoon. My dad and I shared a love of many hymns, much music that we like to enjoy together. This has always been one of my favorite hymns, and didn't know that recently. I guess he and I never talked about it, but I realized it was also one of his favorites. Interestingly, I was sitting in my pew just a second ago, and so it's about time for me to get up. So grab my hymnal, open it up, and that was the page it opened. Number 490, if you have if you want to. Most of you probably know the words, many of you probably do, but it is well with my soul. When peace like my head and death my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. My sin, oh, the list of His glorious thought. My sin not impart, but the whole is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul. With my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when my face shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a the scroll, the drum shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. Thank you.
Tom Ledbetter was a very dear friend of mine. And he taught me that a life well lived is a balance between enjoying and appreciating the wonder and the beauty of life and the finer things that life has to offer in moderation, while at the same time always progressing forward to fulfill our purpose. And to do that through good judgment, our experience, knowledge, wisdom, but most importantly, to do that with a deep and abiding faith in God. My name is Mark Clark, and I first got to know Tom and Marcial in 1994 here at Bering Church of Christ when I was a member. And Marceli called me to invite me to a dinner party that she was having for young singles. And I was very happy to get that call. And I said, yes, absolutely. I will come to your house for a meal. And we had a fantastic and wonderful meal. But better yet, a fantastic and wonderful friendship developed between Tom and Marcel and I. And it has continued for 27 years. And we've kept that dinner party and that friendship alive, even as I've moved around and come back, and it's been fantastic. My friendship with Tom and Marcel is a highlight of my life. And dinners with Tom were always wonderful because Tom really loved people, and he loved to talk to people and hear about people and what was going on in their life. And to walk into their house, the first thing you got from Tom was, tell me what's going on. And he wanted to know everything, and it's almost an interrogation, but not quite. But he wanted to know everything. And you were happy to tell him because as you spoke to him, he just left you with this feeling that he was rooting for you. He believed in you. He was your champion. And through my successes, my failures, the ups and downs, he is there all the way through in the last 27 years and has just been a super wonderful friend. Tom also has a great sense of humor, as you've seen and as you know. Always has a smile on his face, always seems to be laughing inside. And I love that twinkle in his eye that tells you there's a little bit of mischief going on in there. And he's never really quite stopped being a 15-year-old boy. And that is something that just really captivated me. And he can make you laugh so easily and smile. And it was hard not to be encouraged in his presence. But Tom also had a serious side. He was so very, very intelligent. He had a very sharp intellect. He just read and read and read and tried to find out a little bit about everything. And I think he succeeded because you could talk to him about anything. He liked to talk about theology and the Bible, but he also liked to talk about literature and poetry and especially wine. But you didn't have to have high-end conversations with Tom. You could just say, why does my lawnmower not work? And he would give you 1,000 different reasons. Tom just knew a little bit about everything, and he was fantastic to talk to. And Tom had this way of looking at life, a perspective that he just conveyed to those who knew him. he could really see the beauty and the wonder of life. And Tom did appreciate a few fine things in life. He would get some nice things, but I call him elegantly frugal. I hope he appreciates that. But Tom, for instance, he bought a Bose stereo in the late 90s, and he still had it 20 years later. And in this day and age, that sort of attitude to have an appreciation for life as it is and to treasure the things you have without not needing the next best thing is a value that Tom really had in life. And Tom enjoyed poetry, and I think one of the reasons he enjoyed poetry was because he had that perspective on life, and poetry really brought that perspective into expression. And I've selected a few verses from a poem that I like that I think relates to Tom's life. And that poem goes like this: "They are not long, the days of wine and roses. Out of a misty dream, our path emerges for a while, then closes within a dream. I am so very happy that my path intersected with Tom's, and I am such a better person for it. And he has just been super wonderful. He showed us how to live our lives, how to move on to life eternal. I think he also did more for me than that. He showed me how to really bring the light and life and love of Christ into this world through our relationships. Thank you, Tom. We miss you. We love you. Rest in peace."
Thank you, Mark, for those words. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I was not ready for my dad to go. My dad's parents both lived until their 90s, so I was sure that he would as well. And I believed this even as his health was going downhill in the early months of this year. When my mom called me early in the morning of April 29th to tell me the terrible news, I thought, no, this can't be right. But I'm blessed. I had my dad in my life for 60 years. Not everyone can say that. My mom and my brother, my dad's brother and sister, his grandchildren, and all of his extended family are blessed with many years of wonderful memories. As children, he gave me and my brothers the gift of imagination. I remember sitting in his lap and him telling the most wonderful stories that I believe now he was just making up on the spot. They were funny and silly and so entertaining. And we were also fortunate to have a flying car. I'm not sure how many of you were lucky enough to have one. When we were traveling and the road was especially hilly, my dad would push the flying button sometimes when we got to the top of the hill, and we would soar through the air. Of course, we kids were sitting in the back, and we could never see exactly where the magic button was located. But we would always look forward to him making the car fly. My dad gave us the gift of his time. At one point when I was probably junior high age, he began a tradition of taking each child out to dinner, just the two of us, to a restaurant of our choice. I cherished that one-on-one time with him. And I remember my youngest brother, Michael, probably around 5 at the time, he would always pick McDonald's. My dad was a foodie, a bit of a foodie even back then, and he would groan at the thought of going to McDonald's, but he respected Michael's wishes. My dad had high expectations of us. Many of our friends would get money for good grades on their report card, and I think he grudgingly agreed to give us a small amount for A's. We didn't get any money for B's. And for anything less than a B, we had to pay him. So even though our grades were pretty good, he still broke even much of the time. My dad loved his brother and sister. I remember how much they enjoyed each other's company and how he and his brother acted like little kids when they were together. It's like the years were stripped away and they were mischievous, silly boys again. The three of them emailed each other often, and my dad would share his theological musings and stories with them, and they would give him feedback. In fact, their email back and forth conversations about the Bible and religion are just fascinating to read. The rapport between my dad and his siblings was amazing and to be envied. My dad was complex and didn't fit into any stereotype. He was an engineer and one of the most logical people I've ever known. But he also loved beauty and nature and classical music, fine wine, gourmet food, poetry, and good literature. He was fascinated with theology and often wrote biblical essays. He loved to laugh. He had this unique throw back his head silent laugh that we saw often. Children gravitated to my dad. Even though he seemed to fit the description of a curmudgeon, especially in his later years, children loved him. He was so proud of all of his grandkids. I still remember giving him the news that he was going to be a grandfather for the first time and how excited he was. And finally, my dad especially loved my mom. They had over 63 years together, and he knew she was the best thing that ever happened to him. I miss Dad. I will remember him every time I eat a decadent chocolate dessert and think, Dad would love this. And every time I read a really good book, I still think, I need to recommend this one to Dad. I wish I could tell, every time I have a success, no matter how minor at my job, I wish that I could tell Dad. He would be so proud. I know very little about wine, but every glass of wine I drink, I think, I wonder if he would have liked this one. Or more likely, what would Dad think if he knew I was drinking this cheap box wine? I could just hear him making that little snort and rolling his eyes. I will end with this. He had a spreadsheet of important information to read after he passed away. And in it, he had several suggestions for his service, including all the music we're using today. This quote is from a tab with suggestions for his memorial service. Have a party to celebrate my life. If there's wine in the wine cellar, open it and drink up. If food seems appropriate, be sure there's lots of meat and good cheeses. Use the best of breads and olive oils. If salads seem necessary for the women and sissies, go ahead, realizing I had to endure such frivolity while alive. Vegetables such as onions, carrots, tomatoes, potatoes, spinach, etc. are all fine. But you can forget broccoli and cauliflower. Oh yeah, don't forget dessert, and be sure it is all chocolate. And when you're through, pour me a glass of wine, take it to my grave, and pour it on top. Love you, Dad.
As Jim read earlier, my dad was born in Waxahachie, 1934, Claude Thomas and Ella Ruth Ledbetter. He was first of 3 children, followed by brother Don 3 years later, and by sister Claudette 3 years after Don. The family had moved to Houston by the time Don was born, and that was a scene for most of his childhood memories. My sister and I have the unusual advantage of knowing many details of Dad's history, since he wrote it all out years ago. From his accounts, you would think my dad's childhood was pretty idyllic. Many of his early memories were from Dunleavy Street, where he lived until he was in high school. It was there that he had his first paper route, got his first bicycle, and explored the world around him. It's clear to me how Dad's parents doted on him. Grandmommy would make Dad his favorite meals and cook lots of chocolate desserts. Dad, being firstborn and bigger than his siblings, always got first dibs on the brownies. Dad was no goody two-shoes growing up. He and Don had lots of fun, often of the mischievous type. For a while, they worked at their Uncle Cecil's grocery store in West Houston, where they would often play practical jokes on the customers. Dad got his driver's license at the age of 14 and was given plenty of freedom to take the family's 1946 Dodge around town. His buddies, of course, loved having a friend with wheels, and he became the de facto leader of the gang. One of my favorite stories Dad told about he and the gang involved cakes and cookies that were discarded from the local Hinky and Pilot grocery. I think I pronounced that right. The gang decided they would repurpose them as grenades to throw at passersby. They would drive through the wealthy River Oaks neighborhood and toss these stale baked goods at folks they saw on the street, often servants who were waiting at the bus stop. One night, they threw one at a car before realizing it was a policeman. We promptly caught up with Dad and pulled him over. While the policeman was talking with Dad, his buddies in the back seat were discarding the evidence out the back window as fast as they could. Dad always seemed to have good fortune on his side. This was certainly true when he met Mom during the Christmas holiday break from college in 1956. Don had actually met Mom first at a church skating party, but according to Dad, he thought she wasn't wild enough for him, so when Dad asked if he knew of any pretty girls who he could ask out, Don suggested Marcille. They went on free dates during the holidays and then corresponded while back in school. Dad was at UT Austin and Mom was at Abilene Christian. After dating steadily through the summer of '57, Dad proposed to Mom in August, and they were married on December 21st of that year. You never think of these things when you're young, but I realize now that Mom was the perfect match for Dad. I think their personalities, although certainly quite different, they complemented each other very well. Being the first child, Dad had become accustomed to calling shots and generally getting what he wanted. And Mom, she was always kind and understanding and accommodating, so it was a good balance for Dad. I don't mean to imply that Dad was any kind of a bully. He loved Mom deeply and always knew if he was stepping out of bounds or upsetting her. As the years went on, I came to the appreciation that their relationship was based on mutual understanding, love, and acceptance. I only witnessed an abundance of warmth and tenderness that only seemed to mature with time. Dad had an interesting relationship with money. He loved to earn it, but he truly hated to spend it. I know that growing up at the end of the Depression had a strong influence on Dad's thriftiness, as it did with many of his peers. But Dad excelled at keeping up with where every penny went. I have to say that I don't do nearly as well as my dad did at this, but I certainly have learned some valuable financial lessons from him. Dad learned at a young age to avoid debts whenever possible. His memoirs tell us that while he was working at a Houston grocery store as a teenager, he took notice of how many of the customers would buy groceries on credit, which was very alarming to him. Not long after, he took on some debt himself to pay off his first car, 1941 Chevrolet, which he wrecked while delivering papers, only to get into more debt to purchase another auto, a 1949 Ford. The pain of having most of his paper delivery income going to pay off his car loans was a lesson he took to heart, and he did his best to pass that on to his kids. For Dad, saving and investing his hard-earned income was as central to life as was his family and his love for the Lord. When you look at photos from Dad's high school years, you see an extremely handsome dude, a hunk of a guy. He was like a prototype for 1950s good looks. So I sometimes wonder why he couldn't have passed that on to me. Well, if I didn't get his good looks, maybe I got some of his intellect. I always knew that Dad was smart, but as I read some of his writings and looked at all that he had read over a broad range of subjects and styles, I realized that he was truly a deep, critical thinker who loved to learn and was always questioning and challenging his beliefs. I think I have some of those traits, but probably not to the extent that Dad did. Certainly, I have his love for science, his attention to detail, his penchant for planning everything out, his appreciation for God's creation, and his dry sense of humor, and his affinity for good food. For Dad, chocolate was its own food group, as well as the only thing that counted as dessert. Angela can attest to the fact that I share my dad's view on chocolate. Among the many life lessons that Dad passed down to us kids, one of the most important was teaching us responsibility and the value of hard work. When we lived on Winsong in Friendswood, every Saturday was family work day. Our home was on 3 acres, so there was always lots of mowing to be done, gardens to tend to, and trees to plant, as well as housework to be done. Saturday was also hamburger day, where at the end of the day, Dad would fire up the Weber grill and prepare some of the finest hamburgers in town. But there was a catch. Us hungry teenage kids could eat all the hamburgers we wanted, but only if we, in Dad's assessment, had done our share of the Saturday work. Although it was very frustrating rule at the time, today I'm very thankful for Dad's lesson. I mentioned planting trees in Winsong. Although the land there was flat and mostly treeless due to the Gulf Coast gumbo soil, Dad had a vision of turning his plot into a pine forest. So he purchased 300 little pine saplings from the local nursery. It was the job of Michael and me to get them planted around the yard. We would tackle this on many of our work Saturdays, but it was always a slow process digging holes in the gumbo. I didn't finish the job before heading off to college, but Michael and Dad did. I occasionally drive down Winsong to reminisce and check up on my childhood home, and Dad's vision has indeed come to fruition. Even though the planting was laborious and the trees have grown ever so slowly in the nutrient-poor soil, 27 Winsong is now a small pine forest. I consider Dad's pine forest a metaphor for his straightforward approach to life. Set big goals, make a plan to achieve them, and work hard at it until you've accomplished your objective. But there's no need to rush and miss the beauty of life in the process. A slow and steady approach wins the race, while allowing for enjoyment of life's blessings. Even though we see our parents growing old and time taking its toll, it seems we're never ready for their passing. It is certainly true for me of Dad. In the recent years, I came to realize how much I wanted to know Dad more than I had as a child, and to have those meaningful conversations about life, philosophy, faith, and chocolate. To be sure, we had many of those over the recent years, but I long for more. And it saddens me that we can't do that. Dad, we all miss you so much and love you more than I think we ever told you.
When we gathered at the graveside service for Tom back in the spring, we read a few things, but the scripture that we read was from 1 Corinthians 15. Listen, I will tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Some of today is a mystery. We know that we will be changed, that we will be made imperishable. Whether now or later, Tom is a little further down that road than any of us here, and we give thanks for that. And we are told, death is overtaken in victory. And we don't understand what all that means. But we believe, we have faith, and Tom shared that with us. And for that, we give thanks. I had the privilege of having long conversations with Tom. And it's not what I anticipated the first time that Tom and I had a long conversation. In fact, I had already been here a couple of years before Tom and I had our first long conversation. Marcille, we were I taught women's Bible study in the fall from the very beginning, the time that I was here. And so we had good conversations. And I think that Tom's original assessment of Marcille not being wild enough for him may not have been true, because what we found out, if you were a part of women's Bible study, and those of you who are can attest to this, she made the best desserts out of like pretty much everybody. And she made one, I'll never forget this dessert, that I said, what is this? This is one of the best things I've ever eaten in my life. And Marcille told me, I call it better than kissing cake. I said, so see, Tom was wrong. He got his wild girl after all. I knew Marcille, so I didn't know Tom. I knew him as Marcille's husband, who'd come into church on Sunday morning with a huge smile on his face. We'd shake hands, we'd talk, we'd make little pleasantries, but that was the extent of it. He asked me if I'd like to go to lunch. So, sure, yeah, let's go. So he said, I'll come pick you up. Great. So he comes to pick me up here at the church building. Well, that morning, Jen was asking me what we were doing. We'd have our morning coffee, and my wife, Jennifer, said, what are you doing today? And I said, well, I'm going to go to lunch with Tom Ledbetter, Marcille's husband. And she said, well, that should be fun. I was like, yeah, I really don't know him. I know that he's an engineer. And so I was kind of brushing up on, how to talk to engineers. And so we go to lunch, and we sit down, and we go to Polly's, across from where he went to school at Lanier. So we're downtown. He was telling me about this is area where he grew up. So we're sitting eating at Polly's. And so I take a deep breath, and I'm getting ready to talk to an engineer, and he goes right into theology. He knows that I'm a trained theologian, so he wants to talk. Great. So I'd rather talk about this. So we sat there at lunch for almost 2 hours talking theology. One of the last conversations and exchanges I had with Tom was over, if those of you who aren't a part of our church here, we have a passage of scripture that we will read for a given year together that we call our Dwelling in the Word passage. And a few years ago, it was Psalm 46. And I asked everybody at the end of the year, hey, what did you think about this year in Psalm 46? So Tom and I talked a little bit about it, and he said, I want to send you something. Good. He sends me 9 pages that he wrote on Psalm 46. I didn't realize what a treasure that was going to be, but he did. So anyway, back to lunch. We're sitting at lunch, almost 2 hours. And he says, well, I guess we should be going. It's fine. He says, how you all liking your house? I said, well, we really like it a lot. We live here in the neighborhood. We're really enjoying it. He said, well, let me see it. Okay, let's go. So we went to my house. Jennifer, my wife, was there. We walk in. I said, Tom's here. He wanted to see the house. So we see the house. And I don't remember how it started, but Tom and Jennifer started talking about red wine. And because Jennifer likes red wine. So they started talking about red wine. And Tom says, have you tried whatever it was he suggested? And she said, no. Tom looks at me and says, do you have a little bit more time? I said, yeah. he said, let's go to Specs and get Jennifer this bottle of wine. And I was like, okay. So he said, but we need to go to the one downtown because they have the best selection. I was like, okay. So we get back in the car. I lived at the time 59 in Fountain View. We get back on 59, go all the way back downtown. Gets this bottle of wine. We go back to my house. He gets it from Jen and says, okay, let's take you back to the office. So we come in to my office, and sometime during that day, we got to talking about poetry. And he said, I want to come in the office for just a minute, and I want you to read me your favorite poem. And I said, I know just the one. So brought him in, ended up reading him two. That was the day that Tom and I formed a relationship, you would think around theology, but it really wound up being around poetry, around just the love of language. More than the love of language, what poetry has the capacity to do, which is to reflect on life, on how beautiful life can be. So we read a couple of poems. I introduced him to Billy Collins, my favorite poet. And ever so often, Tom and I would talk, and we would exchange these poems with one another. I thought, okay, I've got to read a Billy Collins poem at Tom's service. And I thought, I could find one that sort of reflects Tom, right? That would make you think of Tom. But knowing Tom and the way that we talked about poetry, I thought that he might want something a little different. And so instead, picked a Billy Collins poem that he liked and that captured images in such a way that said, I feel like I've experienced that moment. And so it's from Billy Collins, from one of his collections called The Apple That Astonished Paris. And it's called Schoolsville. Glancing over my shoulder at the past, I realize the number of students I have taught is enough to populate a small town. I can see it nestled in a paper landscape, chalk dust flurrying down in winter nights dark as a blackboard. The population ages but never graduates. On hot afternoons, they sweat the final in the park. And when it's cold, they shiver around stoves, reading disorganized essays out loud. A bell rings on the hour and everybody zigzags into the streets with their books. I forgot all their last names first and their first names last in alphabetical order. But the boy who always had his hand up is an alderman and owns the haberdashery. The girl who signed her papers in lipstick leans against the drugstore, smoking, brushing her hair like a machine. Their grades are sewn into their clothes like references to Hawthorne. The A's stroll along with other A's. The D's honk when they pass another D. All the creative writing students recline on the courthouse lawn and play the lute. Wherever they go, they form a big circle. Needless to say, I am the mayor. I live in the white colonial at Maple and Main. I rarely leave the house. The car deflates in the driveway. Vines twirl around the porch swing. Once in a while, a student knocks on the door with a term paper 15 years late, or a question about Yeats, or double spacing. And sometimes one will appear in a window pane to watch me lecturing the wallpaper, quizzing the chandelier, reprimanding the air. I think all of us at times kind of imagine what people are going to say at our own memorial services. But I'll tell you this much about Tom Ledbetter. I liked him. I just flat liked him. I don't know what people are going to say at my memorial service. Who knows what they'll say at yours? But for Tom, just really liked him. So, and I thank God that those of us in this room and probably countless others who are not here for whatever reason would say the same thing about him. We just really liked Tom.